Can we move on with, on our speaker here, can we get through the Derek and Matt portion of it, or are we stuck? Yeah. All right, so we'll start that, so, Ms. Bouch, would you please read the next item on today's agenda?
Stormwater capacity study next steps.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Derek is going to be our go-to on this particular topic, but just to kind of kick us off, you see the period in front of you there. We're still working on sort of a three-tiered approach where we're talking the individual, the city, and then the region as well. So we continue to work down that note. As we know, we're 12 towns is more than just our own fair city, and so we are part of the George W. Coon Drainage District. Fun fact: George W. Coon's a former Berkeley mayor. For those, I know the history of off already knew that. For those that didn't. Now, the exciting part of this, and it's one thing that I want Derek to talk about a little bit, is that at the Water Resource Commissioner's annual Stormwater Summit, he began the conversation about a multi-community planning grant that they're taking. That GWK is taking on. Well, really, it's WRC with his counterparts in Macomb, Livingston, and Wayne. So, Derek, you want to tell us a segment there?
So, we're going to start with the regional talk because I think it's important to talk about that first. But I've mentioned this to some of you that from a regional standpoint, from a county standpoint specifically, this item has not been one that I felt like we had gotten much support for, or other communities, frankly, from our Water Resource Commissioner. And as I've told Matt, there does finally seem to be some winds of change happening with respect to this. I attended the last Stormwater Summit in October that the Water Resource Commissioner puts on, and I've attended this now for several straight years, and it's been lackluster at best. And this year it was a total change, and it was focused on the issues that we're getting into, and specifically stormwater and extreme rain events and what we're all struggling with. So it was somewhat comforting to finally see that, from the big picture, from the region standpoint, that this is something that is getting more attention. The speakers that were there, I was extremely impressed with. I know Royal Oak is going to be part of this, and their mayor gave a presentation which hit home in a lot of ways. So I'm happy to report that finally, from a regional standpoint, I think we're moving in a positive direction. This multi-community planning grant, which I don't have a ton of details on it at this point, but a few of us here will be attending a meeting, I believe, on December 7th with many of our neighboring communities in the county, and it'll be exciting to see what is available there as it relates to green infrastructure, which is a big piece of what Royal Oak has done, and I think will be a piece of our future as well as far as incorporating green infrastructure. So at the county level, really just of late, we are starting to see some changes, and I guess that is a positive movement. Maybe at this point they're finally starting to listen to some of us about our concerns. So I think we click down if we could. So the next piece of that pyramid was the city, and so this is really the crux of what we want to get into today. I think we've mentioned this in the past, but I think establishing a focus group made up of residents, professionals, administration is probably our next step in this, and to figure out what is going to be our plan of attack for stormwater. There's many components that will likely be a part of that. The first listed is the stormwater ordinance. So we have an existing stormwater ordinance, and it certainly could use some attention. From a regional standpoint, stormwater design standards are changing, and they're changing right now. And one of the speakers at that county presentation spoke to the fact that there are 4 counties, basically all the counties around us, the exception was Washington, and I don't know the specifics of why they weren't part of it, but Oakland, Wayne, Macomb, Livingston even are all getting together and looking at design standards. There's somebody facilitating a bigger discussion about that. So probably with the hope of having some consistency when it comes to stormwater design standards with communities, because this has been a struggle between what you require, because higher detention for new sites is much more expensive. You can drive development out, and so you're trying to balance this out a little bit. The ordinance also could use some attention with respect to redevelopment of sites, commercial sites. At what point does something trigger all new detention on a site? This is a valid question. At what point? It's pretty obvious when you're going to tear down a structure and build something new, whether it's Harvard Commons or SHW, they could all put on detention. Those are a little easier, quite frankly, but what about the smaller site that's doing this addition, right? How do we deal with those? These are big questions, and these are things that we need to address. So we're following what's happening on a regional basis, but I think stormwater ordinance is certainly something that will be changing. The second one is that the new development versus redevelopment. Again, when does a trigger occur? At what point? Royal Oak, I think, is struggling with this one right now, trying to figure out at which point do they say, no, you got to bring it up to current standards. Because in many cases, you're going from nothing to, you know what I mean? And it's dramatic. It's extremely costly. So.
Your discussion on rooftop equivalency units come into play?
Yeah, so one item you don't see here that Royal Oak had a big focus on is the RUs, or the stormwater charters. So we're one of the lucky ones that have that charge and in place to pay for our storm-related charges. So we have not been sued by many of our neighbors that have, some of which have lost those lawsuits, because we already had that charge separated out on our utility bills. This was done years ago. I don't have all the details of why, but it was done, and we took a step in the right direction before a lot of this came down. We were one of the only communities around here that had that in place. I do think that we could revisit those calculations. That we're going back over 10 years since these were developed, and sites do change over time. Sometimes we know about them, sometimes we don't. So this is, again, that charge is based on the impervious and the pervious surface on a site. More hard surface, higher charge, right? So that's how it works. The residential side, everybody's in about the same boat, but on the commercial side, a calculation is performed and we assign them a higher value. So we already have that in place. We've got money budgeted in the current fiscal year to do a little bit of an audit on that potentially and look at that a little bit more, to maybe tighten that up, make sure our commercial base, our non-residential base is up to snuff. I don't think Berkeley is looking at really doing that on the residential level, for reasons that may seem obvious, but we've got 6,400 homes or what have you versus 400, 500 businesses to do that calc each site. But some communities have. I know Pleasant Ridge has done it that way, but you're dealing with a lot less homes, a lot less calculations. But from an REU standpoint, from the stormwater charge standpoint, I think we're in good shape. We could probably tweak it just to make sure that that we've got it fine-tuned. But that was an area that Royal Oak did not have, and so they've recognized that as an area that they need to develop.
Question on that.
Sure.
To what extent does that tie back to an earlier conversation around the design guidelines for our downtown and more broadly the city at large? To what extent is the rainwater and kind of stuff included in what we've done so far with the design guidelines?
Yeah, so I was gonna actually bring that up, because the design guidelines actually has a whole section on low impact design. And that's definitely something that we wanted to make sure was included, because as we have new development come in and major redevelopment, we want to be thoughtful about that. And with that, once we get that design overlay district in place, assuming we get there, then that's the kind of thing that will be measured. That's not to say it's going to force everybody to do it, but it's certainly going to say, hey, look, this is what we want you to be looking at. so, and it was a critical component of, you know, the multi-community planning grant that we got with Oak Park and Huntington Woods, is the green infrastructure, you know. Long-term, I think it's important to understand the Wilson Foundation, they are all about funding stormwater, you know, mitigation projects. And, you know, long-term, when I talk about what are we gonna do in tandem with the three communities, and even more intensely, I would hope, along Coolidge in Berkeley, I mean, that's where I hope to get significant funding for that stormwater mitigation. And this is the stuff we just need to be thinking about.
Thank you.
The last two items here, again, I think are things that we can discuss as a group. They have their limitations, explore opportunities for regional detention. We've got some open areas in Berkeley, whether it's a park or whether it's a boulevard or whatever it may be. There may be opportunities to utilize that space for regional detention, but I want to remind folks that, you know, it's not just as simple as, you know, throwing a big pond over by the ball fields, because I still have to build a pipe that gets that particular water to the pond so that it can hold what it needs to hold before an outlet. So, and that only helps the area that pipe is on. So if you can kind of picture that, these are not inexpensive things that help only a particular region, not a larger area. So, but these are things that we can explore. Segment by segment replacement of combined sewers, certainly the thought of, you know, we can make the sewers larger than they are. The problem is, you know, how big is big enough, right? So we have to understand that, you know, regardless of any of these things, you know, if we get the kind of rain intensity that we've seen in these couple of freak events, you know, we're not talking about, you know, fixing the sewers or eliminating the problem. We're talking more about from 700 homes flooding to maybe 400 homes flooding. I mean, that's the reality of the context of this is there is no building for everything, right? So we have to always keep that in mind. We can do things to help, and we should be doing things to help. But, you know, the kind of intensities that we see when you start to see the amount of water in the roadway that we've seen in some of these events, I mean, making that pipe 1 or 2 size larger is not gonna hold that water. I mean, it's
What's
a
our
tremendous
largest
amount.
pipe size right now?
What's that?
What's the largest pipe size we have?
I think our biggest is around 3 feet in diameter. You know, the counties are much bigger, but,
So we're 3 feet, and was it draining into a regional system?
oh God, some of that stuff is 7, 8 feet.
One's 84, one's 111, and one's
Yeah.
102 inches.
Big pipes. But, you know,
Still.
again, how big is
Right.
big enough, you know?
Right. I
maybe
mean,
these
still,
are
yeah, if you
questions.
put it in there, it's still gonna
Yeah.
reach
So-
max. So even if we had every pipe in our city, for me, this was on my, could list, the,
Big picture.
yeah, pipe dream list.
Nice.
I didn't do that on purpose. All right.
It's rubbing off, it's rubbing off.
So if we had every pipe in our city to 3 feet now, or 4 feet, we're gonna be able to carry more. Like you said, it might not impact 700, it might not impact 400, but there still might be 200 impacted. It's still gonna hit a wall regardless of the capacity when we're trying to interact with the regional system. So we can, and I don't even discuss the potential costs of such a scenario because it's not feasible. And they got a 0 on the feasibility score. But even if we were able to do something like that, because a lot of, you know, what we hear is, well, we just need to replace all our pipes, we just need bigger pipes.
Fix the sewers.
And that's,
Right.
and again, that'll fix a part of it, maybe, probably for some people, but it's not gonna solve the overarching problem, which is what that's gonna have to be solved on a regional
The only thing
basis.
that does.
We know that.
Increases the storage volume in the system.
Right.
But it doesn't increase the throughput.
No, right.
That's where we have the problem.
Right, it just increases,
And
it increases how much we
we'd
can
have
hold
to-
here, but it's gotta get
We
some.
probably have to go to 10 foot to make a significant volume thing in our sewer.
And rest assured, whatever number we would pick, you know, that little bit bigger of a storm is the one that's probably gonna hit next, and then it's gonna be, you know, who decided on this? I mean, there's just, you hate to look at it that way, but that is the fact of it all. And I suppose, you know, we've talked about the education part of this, that, you know, fix the sewers and these discussions that just kind of keep coming up, and some understand it very well and others clearly do not. And so we can't forget about that piece or telling the story. You know, the blunt truth in a lot of this discussion is important to bring about, because there is a blunt truth in all of this. You know, I would love to think we're never gonna have one of these again, but it's really gonna be, you know, what's the story after the next one, I suppose, as much as anything, so. So anyway, that establishing that work group, I think, is very important, and made up of you know, folks from all walks of life, and I think Royal Oak took a really creative approach to that, and we'll probably hear a little bit more about that as well. The last two items on this particular slide don't, you know, necessarily tie into this. They do and they don't. Obviously, we're maintaining what we have. We take a lot of pride in maintaining the asset that we have. You can have backups because pipes collapse. And before all this heavy rain was a part of our discussion, that was really it. Is you know, when people have these kind of issues where many folks flooded, it was because of a pipe failure. And you know, that's something that we have taken a position on to try to avoid to the best of our ability, and continue to be a leader with respect to the percentage that we have lined. A lot of people are jumping on the boat now with the SAW grant and everything else, so more communities are coming up to speed with this. But you know, even my recent discussion with Mad Heights, and I'll touch on them in a second, you know, the preventative maintenance program that Berkeley has, our ability to get through all the pipes in about a 3-year cycle is not something that many communities can touch. You know, they're in the 7-year, 10-year range. The only way you can find a problem or address something is being in the pipe. And so those that are in the pipes the most frequent are going to be able to address the problems the quickest. And so, again, that's not necessarily a capacity discussion, but I just don't want to lose sight of that for folks that think, okay, we're not doing anything. So.
But our relining pipes are are less likely to have points that catch debris, right? They're smoother and therefore less likely to have blockages. So there's a throughput conversation.
That's
Jack.
true, yeah. And you know, I know questions have come up, and you know, wait a minute, you put that liner in, and now you've reduced the capacity of what the pipe can carry. And from an engineering standpoint, when you reduce the diameter, that is a logical thing. But the smoothness factor of what you put in, as opposed to having this rough joint every 8 feet, you've now created a unilateral slick surface. You know, the experts have said, you know, at a bare minimum, you're equal capacity, and really you're probably at higher capacity because you're able to transmit flow because of that smoothness factor, and the small reduction in pipe size is minimal with respect to that. So,
You know, I was gonna build on what you said, Derek. I think because we're all looking at kind of this green infrastructure, we really do need to start educating the public now about the various terms and ways that you can implement water management. At the input session, one of the exercises allows you to put stickies onto a sheet that had a bunch of different options. Many of them were green infrastructure options. And you could say, don't like, you know, kind of don't like, I just don't care, I like, I love. And there were several pictures of green infrastructure items that we talked about incorporating into streetscape, where the residents like had no. And you're sitting there thinking, wait a minute, you guys just lived through, and you're saying you don't want to see permeable pavers like in a new streetscape where car parking might go. I mean, is it that they just don't understand? Because how do you say no to something like that? So I think, to Derek's point, you have to look at those responses and say, they just don't understand what they just said no to. I mean, I don't know, but.
I think there is, you know, still quite a bit of a disconnect there.
Well, yeah, but how much just historically does bricks in a streetscape elicit a reaction specific to Berkeley
For
though.
pavers.
That, do you think that could play a role in this though?
Yeah.
We're getting new ones.
I heard we're redoing the intersection.
Yeah, of course.
Could be.
Once this time, yeah.
Well, then we're not gonna get that Florida firm to come up and do the engineering.
And I think,
True.
you know, a couple real basics in all of this discussion too is, and it seems pretty obvious, but obviously, one of the things that we can do is reduce the amount of pavement in Berkeley if possible.
Yeah.
And increase green space is huge. And I know, you know, you kind of think of all these other things, but the core context is that. And do we have areas, paved areas, that are no longer beneficial, whether it's for parking or whether it's for whatever, you know, taking those away. I just had a discussion with the bowling alley on a different issue. But, you know, it's, you know, they've got quite a bit of asphalt and pavement there. And I think they actually brought up that how high their stormwater utility charge was. And I said, well, I kind of have a sense I know why, because your impervious footprint is massive. And I don't even know if they're connecting the dots to say, I don't even need, I take that off, my bill's gonna go down. And yes, it would, because, you know, put some green in there and get that pavement out would be a huge factor. So I don't wanna, you know, we always think about green infrastructure and porous pavements or bioswales and bioretention, but boy, just some obvious things about, do we have any hard surface that it really isn't needed, you know, can make a huge difference. And anyway, I wanted to throw that out because that is something that, as simple as it sounds, was specific points that Roy Logie even noted on their study. And maybe it's a good time, Matt, now to talk a little bit about Mad Heights. I know that there's been some, you know, I'm not on the social media as much as others, but I know there's a Mad Heights discussion. Mad Heights has a road village, and so there's been some comparisons. And so I followed up with Madison Heights a little bit to talk to them about their program and what they're doing. The interesting point was they did say that when they do reconstruct a road, there are some cases where they build a parallel sewer, parallel to their sanitary sewer. But, here's the big but. They only do that in areas where they have separated systems. So Madison Heights has both combined and separated systems. So we're all combined. There's no if, and, or buts. Mad Heights has both. So there's some back and forth about those. They have situations where they could do that, but they outlet into a designated storm line. So we don't have that option, right? I can't build a half mile of road, separate the two pipes, and then dump the stormwater at the low end into some designated storm pipe. I can't. I gotta tie it right back in to where the line is. So you're getting a little bit extra capacity because of that new pipe. But, you know, you're not changing things dramatically in those cases. So, and I think we had HRC Matt run some numbers for us on Harvard, for instance. You know, what would be the cost to just run another parallel sewer there? Not really focused on where it's gonna outlet or anything of that nature, but, you know, HRC came back and I think said, you know, for $450,000 to run a brand new line in total, you know, half mile road. Well, the job cost, what, just over $2 million total project cost. Not small potatoes, you know, in the context of things. You know, we'd be shrinking scope down quite a bit for that extra piece of pipe that outlets into the same spot. So, so that was a good discussion with Madison Heights. I also asked them, because we had heard something about check valves or control, you know, that they're putting in, and they told me there's been absolutely none of that in Madison Heights. There are no public sewers with check valves. There's no control, as I call it. You know, it's all gravity. We're all gravity. We don't have pump stations. We don't have lift stations here. Frankly, nor would I really want to, because those have that's a whole nother layer of complications. Flipping a switch or a float that doesn't work or whatever it might be. So,
And I think we've done a good job now, since we've had a couple of serious events here, explaining how our system worked. Because again, right away, that was, somebody didn't, you know, pull the switch until it was too late, or somebody didn't, you know, empty, you know, there was a check valve somewhere. somebody was asleep at the wheel. And that's not how it works. It's all gravity in our system. That we're feeding into.
It's gravity.
There are, yeah, right, it's all gravity. There are not valves, there's no control. It's just a matter of how much water can rush through the pipe and where it's got to get into and where it's going to exit.
And I think as we move on to the residential piece, before we get there, one more thing on the regional piece of this, because this is an important piece, I believe, that I'm surprised that the county, and they haven't up to this point, they have not like oversaw these 13, 14 communities that make up our Coon district, right? They have not, to my knowledge, said, well, wait a minute, Berkeley's got whatever, 50% restricted covers, and Royal Oak's got. To me, if I was responsible for this entire network, you would think that there would be some consistency. You would think there would be some management at that simple level to say, okay, everybody's playing by the same rules, because clearly, being downstream of a community, you're at their whims, right? So one of the first things I thought of after one of these events was, okay, Southfield has a piece that comes into Berkeley, and so is Southfield unrestricted? And I went out and had somebody go check, and I was happy to hear back that no, they've got, there's a fair amount of restricted covers upstream of us, but this seems pretty obvious to people that, let's all play by the same rules so that you don't get into the pipe before I got a chance to get in the pipe. But I think the county needs to look at that as well, right? To be able to say, okay, we are all playing at least by similar rules, and it's not one community that's just getting in there before everybody else even has a chance to have their piece of the capacity. So that's another regional component.
Has the county considered doing any flow modeling of their system so that we know what we're up against?
Not that I'm aware of, Jack. The real difficult part of monitoring sewer flow has not been an exact science by any stretch. It's very difficult, and it's not. You often end up, the few studies I've been involved with a few years ago, sometimes you just have more questions than answers when you try to monitor flow. It's a challenging thing. At some level, you think you got to be able to do it to understand what's in the pipe, but it's a real challenge. And I want to explain to everybody that we've got the sewer bill that I get every month from my wholesale sewer charges from the county is two things. It's got a stormwater charge, and it's got a sanitary charge on it. So you may ask yourself, well, wait a minute, we're combined, and how the heck do they even figure this out? So what they do is they base the sanitary charge off of wholesale water meters with the thought that what goes through your water, when you turn on the faucet, that's sanitary, right? And that basically everything else is essentially stormwater related. So our stormwater fee that we have, that everybody pays for that stormwater piece, as well as our George W. Krupa outstanding bonds that we have, so it offsets those charges. So, but there's a stormwater piece and there's a sanitary piece on that bill. So. All right, and I think the last piece is the residential side. Michelle, if you could skip me down, I think we have one more. So on that pyramid, what can the residents do? Downspout disconnections are huge, okay? So if your roof drains are tied into your sewer, that's water that's hitting the system pretty fast, off the roof, into the sewers, like right now. And Berkeley has already gone through this exercise a couple decades ago where this was a big issue, and I don't, again, have all the details on it, but I know from a residential side, this was a big deal. And from what I can see out driving around, it certainly appears residential downspouts are predominantly disconnected. I'm not sure how much of that is true on the commercial side. Now, commercial sides can have detention, you got to look at the whole picture, but I think downspouts and both residential and commercial is something that we can probably still make some improvement sides. Probably more specifically on the commercial side, but from time to time, I'm sure you can have a resident who is trying to avoid that water splashing here, so they tie it in somehow, some way into their system. That's something hopefully we can work with building on, and when there are inspections, to make sure that, check the mark, the downspouts are disconnected, and we can move on.
How do you know if a downspouts disconnected or not?
So you can, basically, your roof drainage going through your gutters as it
Yes.
comes down, you want it to splash on grade, you want it to splash on your driveway or in the grass.
Okay.
If it just goes right down into the ground and just goes to who knows where, there's the potential that that's tied in. Now, there's also the potential that that just leads to a flash drain or something that doesn't outlet into the pipe. So you don't want to, you can test some things to figure that out, but, if you see the downspout come down and then it comes out and it just splashes into the grass or onto the drive, that's
That's what you want.
It's disconnected, that's what you want.
Like at my house, which was an old one, it was converted, it came down and then there's a pipe right there going straight down in the ground. And those are concrete is shut now.
Yeah.
That's what they did probably 30 years ago.
Exactly.
They capped it in concrete. But the pipe is still there, but.
And I know it doesn't seem, especially as tight as we are, building wise, you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, Derek, come on, it splashes out there, and the road's right there. I mean, really, does it, but it does.
Yeah.
There is an intensity change with those. You at least give it an opportunity to soak into the grass or take a little more time before it actually enters the sewer.
The other thing we gotta talk about is sump pumps. Well, a lot of the houses in Berkeley that have sump pumps have a valve where they can go either into the sewer or outside. And at one time, it was said that they had to be outside into the grass. But there's a lot of them around that aren't. They're pumping right into the sewer.
So that's an area that, maybe we can check at and look at as well, yeah. And not that these outside discharges don't have their fair share of problems, because, depending on where you're throwing it, you can cause some issues, but downspout disconnections is huge. Maintaining private leads, again, I'm glad this one is here because, we're going through our pipes every 3 years, and we're proud of that. As a homeowner, it's important for all of us to understand or know what our own pipes are looking at or functioning. We know for a fact that many residential properties that have their 6-inch leads or whatever, the effective diameter is probably significantly reduced because of tree roots or other things. And so, some of this is, God, how would we ever know whether or not it was our pipes that caused an issue, or somebody, or everybody on that particular block had restrictions and couldn't even get it to our lines? Again, this is something that you have to bring up. It's important to have residents maintain their own lines as well, because it can cause them problems. No different than it can cause us problems. Rain barrels and rain gardens. Again, these are not things that are gonna save the day for us, but they are things that can help. Rain gardens specifically are more geared towards water quality as opposed to capacity discussion. Hopefully that makes sense. So, putting in a rain garden is not necessarily storing more water. Bioretention areas actually store water and hold and flood control. Rain gardens are more water quality type issues, but in any event, still helpful. Backflow prevention measures, we've talked about this, and check valves. They're not the end-all, fix-all. They need to be maintained. They have their own share of issues. When people say, well, I got one, but I still flooded, they need to be maintained, and they can have blockages that affect how they function. So they can be helpful, but they require maintenance. They require regular checkups as well.
And heard some people there getting very cheap, like drain ones, and that is not what we're talking about. Not a whole house, not a whole system.
Kind of a point thing, but yeah. So, I know we had, who was that plumber that did the little educational presentation at the
Paul C.
library?
Scott.
Which one was it?
Paul C. Scott.
Paul C. Scott. And I was very impressed with that presentation. It really did a nice presentation. They're, I think, one of our local plumbers, and really did a nice job explaining that process. It was a full house, and that may be something that we would as well, because I was very impressed with that. Certainly, we know not every plumber is that qualified, but that was a very impressive presentation, and it sounds like they had a good handle on things. So.
And we sold the rain barrels there as well.
Yep.
So.
So next steps, I think, you know, figuring out a way to establish this group, this made up of experts and otherwise is gonna be a good thing for us to do. I know we're gonna hear from Royal Oak shortly, and I think their story really helped set the context for us. I was very impressed listening to the previous presentation on it, and I think that'll help kind of get us to the next steps. You know, how do we incorporate green infrastructure? Is it a project by project thing? Is it going out and doing it on its own? Obviously, these are things that we're gonna have to think about. You can certainly incorporate green infrastructure with newer projects, so I think that would be definitely smart to do, but maybe we even tackle it, you know, more focused on just projects that involve green infrastructure, which I know Royal Oak has done quite a bit of, so.
Building on that, on the topic of what Royal Oak has done, James is a assistant to the city manager for the city of Royal Oak. He's coming to discuss with us and follow up on the letter that was, letter of the task force and the recommendations that was included in the packet. So, James, you were here through the whole process, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
from the active bit of it.
Okay.
Yeah, the task force was about to start in approximately the fall of 2015, but it hit a snag when my predecessor, Stuart Meek, had departed the city. And then when I arrived, I basically took it on. So, yeah, thanks for having me. And I'm pretty informal with this, but so if you have any questions as we go along, feel free to stop me. I'll basically start kind of with our background, which I'm sure is not that dissimilar from you guys at the table here. But back in the early 90s, we had 2 consecutive rainstorms that were really, really large. And this prompted our first real efforts towards stormwater management. During this, we brought in an assessment of our system capacity. We started a catch basin restricted lid program. We did some construction of relief sewers where we needed them. And we also implemented our first stormwater detention ordinance during this time. Basically, all of our efforts at that point were focused on gray infrastructure. And it did work. We were able to increase our storage capacity to about 21 million gallons. And the city costs ended up being about $10 million over between 91 to roughly 2010. So it was effective, and we got to the point where we were able to handle a 10-year storm. However, we had certainly complaints that came from it, from the business community, and also from the environmental community as we gone along. But the business community didn't like our stormwater detention ordinance due to the restrictiveness, the prescribed nature that it had. And then the environmental side, nobody was really happy with the fact that we weren't doing anything by way of green infrastructure. And our city commission, especially over the last 8 to 10 years, has been really forward-thinking when it comes to things like green infrastructure and the environment. So they wanted to start pushing us. And eventually we did, in 2015, make some amendments to our ordinance that allowed for variances to bring in some green infrastructure. And what we ended up doing was we brought in OHM. I don't know if you guys have done any work with them. They've done a lot of work with our sewer system. And they basically assessed the improvements we've been making. They wanted to take a look and see how our system was working out. They did this starting towards the end of the summer in 2014, which, as we all know, ended up being a really, really difficult time in our systems. And the interesting thing here was they were scheduled to actually take their monitors out of our system probably 2 weeks before August 11th. They were delayed. So we actually got some really interesting data on August 11th, 2014. What we did find was that, yes, our system is working really well. except for the beyond the 10-year storm areas. So we decided at that point that we needed to look into the issue a little deeper, and City Manager Don Johnson suggested putting together a task force, and it actually was supposed to be a relatively informal thing. It was a task force that was supposed to look at our detention ordinance, and it was going to recommend to him potential changes. So our task force was made up of mostly technical and environmental professionals, but we also brought in the Chamber of Commerce, some local architects, and we also had a lot of city staff and brought in a city commission member on this.
You were on it as well?
Yes, I was also on it. More so on the coordination effort and bringing together everybody's thoughts. I was called the chair, but it was mostly to, I was kind of the driving force behind getting the work done. So we did try and balance the business community members, and the environmental concerns, as well as bringing in the technical people. And yeah, our purpose was initially to investigate the current detention ordinance and to make recommendations. So I'll get into the process a little bit here. We began basically by doing a kind of a visioning meeting where we got everybody on the task force together to kind of take a look and figure out what would our vision for stormwater in Royal Oak be, our stormwater management vision. That way we could kind of gear all of our efforts towards that. The vision ended up becoming that we wanted to have a stormwater system that involved more green infrastructure, that involved all of Royal Oak properties, so there was some sense of equity, and that was effective at reducing the combined sewer overflows. So based off that, we started doing some study sessions, looking at different communities that we knew had high reputations for their stormwater program. So the city of Seattle and Washington, Ann Arbor were two of the big ones we focused on. And these programs started broadening the way we were thinking about our work, because initially we started very one-track, how do we address this ordinance? And it started broadening, hey, it's not just our ordinance that we need to deal with. We need to deal with how do we fund stormwater programming, how do we deal with any kind of stormwater management planning efforts. And so after all that, we went through, probably had to be about 15 versions of a report that we were able to finally get everybody on board with. And then once we had that fine-tuned, we made a report, our recommendations to the city commission as well as the city manager. And we recommended that we change the ordinance that we currently have, that it would be able to include all properties, kind of getting rid of our exemptions from single and two-family homes, and that we promote green infrastructure where it was feasible and effective being kind of a key underlying word there, because a good chunk of the city of Royal Oak, probably much like Berkeley, is clay or infiltrated soil. The south end of town has a lot more sand that we've been doing a lot of our green infrastructure in, but a good chunk of the city is clay. We also recommended that the city starts to develop, adopt, and implement a stormwater management plan that can look at all of our efforts in a more comprehensive way. And then also, and this has kind of been the big one, was to investigate implementing a stormwater utility within the city. And I'm trying to get a little into that there. We did have a lot of outside issues that were going on at the same time as we were doing this work. Obviously, our city commission was really, really heavily focused on trying to bring green infrastructure. They were really, I think they ended up really happy with where we ended up. We had a lot of business pressure to loosen our standards for detention. And this is something that wasn't new, but it was going on, you know, even prior to August 11th, 2014. And truthfully, August 11th, 2014 gave us a little bit more of more data to say, look, we can't use that. You know, even though it's working. We need to keep doing this. We need to keep these standards. But one of the big outside issues that affected where we ended up would be the final settlement we had in our class action lawsuit, which was the Schroeder versus City of Royal Oak. This is a law firm that's going around to multiple communities in the metro area and across the state. We actually were in really good shape for a while, and they had appealed, and the appeal was denied at first. They asked for reconsideration. After a pretty long process, we ended up being told by our attorneys that, you know, we need to come to a settlement on this. And our settlement, while it wasn't as overarching as, say, Birmingham's, where they had to absolutely change the way they billed for all of their stormwater, we were able to maintain our commodity charge on stormwater that we pay, basically the pass-through to Oakland County and DWSD. But we did have to change the way we fund our debt service for the GWK. And so what we ended up doing is that's part of why we are now going through the process of doing a stormwater utility in the city of Royal Oak. Because right now, for this year, we ended up doing an ad valorem tax as allowed through the drain code, but it's not equitable, it's not fair. The value of your property has nothing to do with the water, the stormwater that's draining into your sewer system. Also, we've been trying to maintain focus on what's going on in Lansing. There is a legislation out there that would make a stormwater utility much more possible to happen. And it was first introduced probably back in 2015, and it died during the last session, and it's looking like it might die again this session and have to be reintroduced. But we've been trying to make sure that everything we do is lined up with the language of that act. So basically, the outcomes out of this is that during the process, after the process, the city has a renewed focus on green infrastructure process or programs. We are currently doing our second major rain garden installation. Should be, I think it's totally wrapped up now, on 4th Street, just outside of the downtown area, which again is a heavy sandy soil area. We're increasing our green infrastructure outreach. We put together a rain garden booklet, a how-to guide for residents who are interested in putting them together. And then also, we are working with OHM again to do our stormwater and utility study. And this will involve also a stormwater management plan and a new ordinance, changed up ordinance. So that's pretty much what happened, where we are, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions for James, Matt?
We're working through the process right now, and we just, I think you heard us, we talked about the education portion of it. Helping people realize the role that soil content plays in all this. Did you guys have a big issue with that, or was it more understood? Because you guys have to deal with two different situations with soil content. Did you find the permeability of the soil was a sticking point?
It's going to be as we move forward with more GI projects. Because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do a pretty small rain garden on a small property in the north side of town where there's a lot of clay soil. But people, as we move forward into doing our credits with the stormwater utility, people are gonna wanna try it, and it's not gonna be really benefiting anybody. So it hasn't been an issue yet, but it's not to to say that it's not gonna be. And that's constantly a discussion as we're going through with the stormwater utility is, do we have different rate factors based on soil type, right? Because obviously you're getting a lot less rain runoff from a sandy soil site than you would be on the clay site. But I don't know that we're gonna get there now, because that's going to be extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. So I don't think we're gonna get there, at least not for now. And I will say kind of some of the along with the outcomes, I didn't really get into this too much, but we really did receive a lot of support for the most part on the project. Granted, when it came time to finally present to the city commission, and we were suggesting doing a stormwater utility, there was some resident backlash to the idea of what was dubbed the Krazan tax.
Congratulations.
I had my
Wow.
that was pretty good. But,
Gosh.
yeah, so there's still, right? Isn't that pretty good? So you do have to keep that in mind, and it's important to continue to educate, because a lot of people don't understand, you know, this is the stuff we don't see, you know, we don't see the underground stuff, and people don't understand how important the storm system and the sewer systems are. But, so, you gotta be ready for that type of backlash and be ready to educate, for sure.
I may have missed this a minute ago, I was reading through attachment 1. The GI pilot sites that you had here,
Yeah.
have those all been implemented on?
I think so. Which ones are on the list?
You
at this point?
have downtown city parking lot, Woodward Alley, the Woodward side subdivision, one on Campbell Road, and Star JC and VFW Park.
We haven't done, we haven't done a whole lot of those.
Okay. But just, and then that isn't that necessarily here or there, but that was estimated to capture about 2.2 million gallons of product.
Yeah. One of the big ones
Pretty
is,
significant.
one of the big ones is not even, I don't even think on that list, but if we could somehow capture Woodward, Woodward Ave totally, that would be,
Huge.
that would, I don't wanna speak too out of turn, but that would almost solve a lot of our basement backup issues.
Woodward's upstream for you guys.
Uh-huh. And there is 4 lanes in either direction that flows completely into our system during a rainstorm. So, yeah.
Well, those are the types of, hi, I'm Steve, thank you for being here.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, those are the types of regional things that we can think about though. So Woodward is a great example, we have frontage there, but there's also Greenfields and
Yeah.
12 on 11, and, you know, Webster and all that kind of stuff, whatever we can do as cities to think about how we can help one another.
Absolutely.
Because, you know, the rain doesn't discriminate, so.
And you guys are aware of Oakland County's project? They're doing kind of a regional collaboration. Yeah, okay.
I thought a little bit, yeah. And we
So that's at least a start.
we started to see a little bit of, you know, people being receptive to the dialogue and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So is your capacity still about 21.1 million?
As far as what we've gained?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it may have, you know, may have gained a little bit with this latest rain garden project, but.
We've had a stormwater utility in Berkeley for some time to pay for our wholesale charges, some GWP amounts, as I understand it. And you guys are moving towards that. Do you envision green infrastructure being funded out of that utility? Okay.
Yes, eventually. It may
Eventually.
not be right away. There may be the sticker shock initially. But yeah, we do intend that all stormwater activities come out of that. Yeah. Green infrastructure, maintenance, operations.
And I know there's been some lessons learned with some of the green infrastructure in Royal Oak and DPW and salting and things that,
Yeah.
and I think it would, you know, as we move towards that, we need to talk with you guys and say,
Oh,
okay, you know, what
absolutely.
worked, but what didn't, you know, I know salting and plowing, where you put the snow, had a big impact on some of the bio retention in the rain gardens.
We had some rain gardens that didn't fare well over the first winter due to salt. And also one thing, rain gardens are great, low maintenance landscaping, but low maintenance doesn't mean no maintenance. And we do have to have somebody come out, I think it's about 4 times during the growing season, that they come out and they do some weeding, they clean it up, because you still do get some plants that aren't supposed to be there growing. And the first year we didn't really think about it, I don't think too much. And come about August, we're getting phone calls from angry residents, like, what is this thing growing in our rain garden? Yeah, it's important to keep that in mind.
How many folks joined your task force?
Oh, shit, hold on. Let me count. We had 9 outside, plus 1 city commissioner, and then some staff floating in. So we were right around 12 at most meetings.
What, anything you would do different specific to that group? Is there any fields you specifically seek out or areas of expertise that you didn't have or that really worked well?
The one thing I would put on it is, I do think we could have done a better job of planning the timeline of the work better, because this project did end up going on a lot longer than it should have. As far as the makeup of the group, I think we had a really good makeup. We had planners, we had environmental planners, we had architects, we had engineers, and then we had people who had absolutely no idea about anything related to stormwater. So I would try and keep the makeup roughly the same, but really trying to stay on top of a set timeline and an agreed upon kind of length of time that we keep going.
What would you say were your biggest challenges that you had to overcome?
And it's good, it's similar to most types of projects where you have people from the business community that will have one specific plan in mind, and then people from the environmental side that have the exact opposite viewpoint. Trying to merge completely diverging thoughts on a topic, which, I mean, you get in all sorts of municipal projects, so, yeah. Yeah, trying to get to a point where everybody was equally upset.
At the same time.
Yeah, at the same time,
Well,
about
I
the
like
same
that.
thing. Yeah, you gotta get equally a little bit angry.
Oh.
That's what consensus is, right?
Other questions for James?
You said initially that the charge was to review ordinances.
Yeah, just
How did
initially
you come to that conclusion that that was the right thing
to expand the scope, or to just look at the ordinance.
to just look at the ordinance? I mean, because I'm guessing there's probably a lot of issues related to that, but how did you narrow it down to that?
Well, that was the initial charge when it started, and that was actually before I was actually with the city. So I can't speak to it too much. I just know that the idea was, here we're still getting these complaints from the business community that the ordinance is too strict. We're getting complaints from the environmental community and the city commission that we need to implement more green infrastructure, and it wasn't really too present in the ordinance. So that was where the initial charge came from.
So any of the ordinances changed, and if so, what was the result? I mean, is it turning out like you wanted to, or?
I think so. They're not changed yet. We're going through this stormwater apportionment, the utility apportionment study phase first, because that's gonna significantly impact a stormwater management plan, and then also the detention ordinance. It will likely become part of one bigger stormwater ordinance.
Was the outcome what you expected, or did you get some unexpected things?
I'd say more or less, yes. It was what I expected. Yeah.
Did you do the capacity study prior to task force?
Yep.
Prior to the task force start?
Yeah, actually, the capacity study was done right before. It was, part of what led into doing the task force. Yeah.
Have you had a significant flood event since 14?
Significant? No. No. We've had some flooding, but mostly localized, a couple dozen, I think, homes at once, but nothing compared to
Storm
other
17.
areas. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you could do something different, what would you do?
Yeah, I would just try and maybe, and just from me as the chair, being a little bit more of a taskmaster, trying to keep everybody on it. We had a few meetings that ran longer than they should have, because sometimes you get off topic, but,
Did you fund the current green infrastructure done through the utilities?
we haven't yet.
So how
Because
did
we
you-
haven't done the utility yet.
Okay.
Most of our green infrastructure programs have been funded with a little bit of matching funds through the water sewer fund, but with state grants. The non-point source pollution program through the DEQ has been really helpful. With the 4th Street Rain Garden
Yeah,
project
so
and the
they're
outreach.
really well done.
Yeah. But, yeah.
I believe, is there a boulevard section that
Oh, Vincetta.
is?
We did Vincetta Boulevard.
Okay. Storage of, flood
we did-
control?
Yeah, we did some rain gardens on Vincetta, just, I think it was west of Woodward. I think just up in the little northwest corner there.
Okay.
It's a bit of a detailed question, but for new construction or rebuilds on a smaller parcel, talk about recommendation being, any new building needs to have retention and stuff, or participate via payment in lieu of detention. Is that like a one-time thing, or is that an annual? How does that?
That hasn't fully been worked out. That was a recommendation that, I think we lifted that a little bit from Ann Arbor's program. They allow for that sort of thing. If you can't provide your detention on site, you can substitute it somewhere else in the city. It hasn't fully come to fruition yet, but I can see some of that happening through this utility, which we're hoping to be done and in place by July 1.
It seems like a annual kind of thing makes sense, because it's just a one-time payment for one rain event, and it doesn't work that way, so.
Absolutely.
It'd have to be some kind of recurring.
Well, and also, and I think that the payment, the utility fee will kind of roll under that too. If
Right.
you can't provide detention, then your utility fee will be higher.
Constant to that,
Yeah.
I think one of the struggles that I'm sure any community establishing the fee and the charges and the concept of redevelopment, and when a site comes in and just wants to do an addition, and when do you trigger, full
Yeah.
detention requirements, and I don't know if you guys have solved that, or not.
As far as the detention requirements, I don't know that we solved that, but, because our current ordinance allows for up to 6,100 square feet of improvements until you trigger. Which, it's cumulative as well. So if you did 3,000 square feet of your parking lot, and then did 10 years later, now you want to do your whole parking lot. Now it's going to be triggered, right? And we've ran into so many issues there with keeping track of these. Property owners change, but that lien on the property doesn't change.
That's a real challenge, isn't it?
Yes. And the new property owner has no idea about it, so. That was, and with the utility, again, it's starting to sound like the utility is gonna solve all our problems, but it won't. That will be, if you increase your impervious area, it's going to change the way you're billed for parking. So whether we haven't figured out if we're gonna be charging every single property based completely on impervious, or if there's gonna be tiered systems where, 0 to 5,000 square feet of impervious is this category, 5 to 10, whatever. We haven't completely come to that, but, if you start bumping yourself into a different tier, you're gonna be charged more. So.
This might be being too specific, but the new developments in the place of the former golf course, that's all residential, correct?
Yes.
Did this play any role in that, or was that already more or less planned?
That was pretty much already planned
Okay.
as this was going on, but they, thankfully, we had that really large site, that 40 acre site right next to where that development's going on, that used to be the golf course, that, we were incorporating, some retention ponds into, and expanding the old retention ponds that were there to detain water from the site, the development site. So that was one of those nice times where we actually had space to do something.
So some of it did end up being dedicated to stormwater then?
Yes, but that's on our park.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, additional comments, questions? Thank you, James,
All right.
for
Thank
for
you.
visiting with
Absolutely.
us today and providing some context and some things that we're looking
Absolutely.
to
Good
do
luck.
now in the future.
Yes, you can see it was a lot of work and research.
I do see that, I appreciate you bringing
I have it
for
just in
that
case.
visual view of just.
I never know what kind of questions are gonna come, so I like to be.
Five.
Of which one?
The first one.
Find out. Yeah, absolutely, and Matt, he knows how to find me, and Darcel knows how to find me. If you have any more questions, please.
Thank you.
Sure we will. This isn't a
Yeah.
training topic, so I'm sure we'll be back to.
Absolutely. Good luck with the
They're not
rest of
getting
your
better.
day.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Speaking of the rest of our day, it appears that we're gonna have a little break now.
There's probably some next steps that we want to consider as a result of this conversation. We could capture those and then maybe recap everything vouchers.
Well, the steps certainly from Derek that we're looking to do right now is assembling our own task force, identifying, finding the folks, making sure that we have a good number. We need to have some staff support there as well to make sure that we have a good, not only a representative group, but a group that is energized and focused on what we're going to test.
And I do see I don't know what everyone else is looking at, but I know as a part of the recommendations from that summit, I did see the listing of those that were on the Royal Oak task force with titles, so you can get a sense of, I mean, they are crossing all walks of life.
It's on the actual report.
Yeah, those are more of the longer attachments, so.
Engineers and James and superintendents, condo associations, a commissioner, public service director, of course, and so it's for that.
So we need to put that together. We need to identify before we get that posted, how we're going to advertise it, how we're going to advertise it, get that board together. And then we're going to have to work, with this group and with you certainly, to identify the goals. Okay, what are the goals of this group? Get together and talk about engineering things and drainage. It's cool, but we need to have goals that we're trying to
Where are we
achieve.
going? Yeah.
Timelines built in there. I don't think we're gonna do that right now, but that's gonna be the next step. Certainly on our end, we need to continue to identify opportunities for green infrastructure where we can. I think there are some definite places where we can utilize that more. In the city, we need to identify those and target those and figure out what it's going to take to create those.
infrastructure opportunities along Woolwich and 11 will be done for us through this moment.
Just identifying.
Yes, there's some additional as well. One of the.
Stormwater ordinance is gonna be a big piece.
Yeah.
You know, whether we choose to add more restricted covers, right? You know, we added a few hundred more.
Are we collecting data? Is there any way we can collect to see?
No, we're just kind of seeing how things work. I mean, I will say you know, from a call standpoint or what have you, I mean, I'm not really, Sean, you mentioned it to me that he really hasn't noticed a big change as it relates to, you know, an increase in flooded streets or that thing. Obviously, it's depending on the rain events, and during leaf season is where we get most concerned about it for obvious reasons. If you have a high rain event when you've got all the curbside leaves in the road, you know, there could be an issue there. But I mean, there's certainly the opportunity to add more restricted covers, that we identified that as a pretty, you know, Royal Oak went there, did that as well. One of their first things, no different than what we've done. We've had restricted covers for some time, but we could certainly add more. And, you know, how much is enough is always gonna be a balancing act. But, you know, we've gone to covers that are a little less likely to clog. We're trying to get away from the covers that have all the holes sort of centered, if you will, and trying to go more to a cover where the holes are, a few holes are spread out a little bit more. There's a less likelihood that they're gonna get jammed up. So anyway, those are small things, but in the big picture, they all help. So restricted covers, I think, will always be a part of our discussion.
We got back up with the work group, for the feasibility of stormwater ordinance, requirements for new development and redevelopment, the infrastructure that we just mentioned, opportunities to be part of the regional conversation, segment by segment replacing sewers is something that we can look at as we're doing other projects. I think that's a pretty good start for the tasks. Anything else we're missing from this conversation that we want to make sure we get on board here? I mean, obviously, unlike, I guess, everything that we do talk about today is ongoing, but this is one of those things that we have done. We've taken a number of steps before. We're going to continue to look at every alternative, every solution, potentially to help ease our system, the burden on our system in the future. There are certainly things that we can do, and then if we go back to the beginning of the conversation, we have to be part of the regional conversation as well. That's a big component of this, is being present, being at the table, having an opportunity to share our resident story, our business, our story, you know, what's happened and what's continuing to happen, at least on a more frequent basis right now, so that we can work to be part of the solution.
I think the communication is going to continue to be key. A couple of months ago, we had a resident that came to the microphone, and it appeared as though there was no progress being made whatsoever, and that certainly, you know, wasn't the case. And through a little bit of education, we realized, you know, all the things that we have been doing. So as we get to the task force, I think that could be a tremendous mechanism to provide more regular and focused communications. And then, you know, task forces are meant to accomplish a specific objective, and then once they're done, we think very much maybe coming out of that can sort of be some sort of an ongoing kind of, you know, body that provides guidance and oversight and feedback, you know, sort of a Friends of Public Works or something like that can help provide, that's right, provide some guidance. But from a communication and awareness and perspective, so the good work that we are doing can be more easily seen and recognized.
Excellent. Anything else from?
And just so, I mean, it's wonderful that, you know, you can Google this is the Royal Oak Stormwater Task Force report, which if you just Google that in and this PDF comes up. If anybody cares to look at these reports, they're really great. I found them to be very helpful summaries. They've also got their green infrastructure evaluation report from Royal Oak, you know, as well. So Royal Oak has spent, you know, a lot of effort in preparing these things. So I found them to be nice resources just to kind of go back and get yourself back to square one. But those are out there if anyone cares to look.